It is terrific. It is so terrific to be back here. I was, as part of this ADM+S project, I was here in 2022 and just learned enormously from my interactions with lots of the, with academics here, with folks in government, with just a wide variety of researchers. And I've always learned so much, and it's just a privilege to be able to present to such an informed group. And also, I wanted to say that just thank you so much, Mark, for your introduction and for your inspiration for a lot of the work I do. As you'll see in a slide later on, I directly engage with Mark's work in this project. And there's so much that, there that I find useful and grounding in an era of rampant simulation and very fascinating simulation and troubling in many respects as well. So to start today's inquiry, to sort of think about what is it about simulation that might need regulation, I wanted to start with a little, so there's lots of books out there now that are really advancing the idea that generative AI changes everything. And maybe it does, maybe it does change a lot. I know that lots of us were very surprised to see the extent of fluent language, compelling images, even videos and sounds that are coming out of generative AI systems. Two of the books that are more in this area of predicting revolution are Saul Kahn's Brave New Words, Ethan Mollick's Co-Intelligence. Mollick's Twitter feed or X feed is sort of continually showing studies of AI doing very well the kind of work that business folks do, that managers do, that professors do, that students do, et cetera. And Kahn actually, I think, branded this book with OpenAI with the development of AI tutors that were promised personalized education to everyone. And certainly as someone who grew up in in some areas that did not have a full range of educational opportunities, in Oklahoma City particularly, I sometimes felt like I see this and I say, wow, that could be quite an amazing, could have had quite an impact on me and others. But I also want to note that the technology, if we put too many of our eggs in that basket, could go wrong. And so a hypothetical that I love to start a talk out with like this on is imagine a future where we have students who are writing papers, exams using ChatGPT. But then, hey, why let them have all the fun? We can have professors using ChatGPT to evaluate the papers. And then you could have an arms race in a way where the idea is, well, can I get the paper writing software that is best at provoking the response of an A or a top-level grade from the paper reading software, et cetera. I think there's something where we wouldn't want this future, right? We'd sort of feel like there's something troubling here. And some of the normative senses in which we could find this to be troubling might be the idea of cheating or someone sort of using, not really thinking. But the normative frame I want to use in this talk for this and a variety of other situations is the problem of simulation. Right? That it seems like we have an educational process here, but we're really just simulating it without getting at the core rationale for it. And this idea of sort of going through the motions of creating the external indicia of a thing without getting to the thing itself is a framework that I think is useful. I will say that that this sometimes this perspective is going to strike some as old-fashioned humanism or as an approach that is trying to find the intrinsic and the real categories, normative categories that have been challenged by various social sciences and theories. But I want to try to hold on to them, and I'll give some rationales for why. I think that you might say, well, I was just giving a reductio ad absurdum with this educational example. And by the way, I quoted after virtue in that slide because it begins with the hypothetical imagining a future where people have fragments of moral codes, but don't really understand the theoretical or foundations of them. And I think that's one of the core problems with the simulated education example. And you might think that this is sort of a reductio ad absurdum, but I think we should follow it, right? We should follow these logics the way that, say, Kurt Vonnegut's satirical novel Player Piano does about the logics of automation, the way that a movie Wall-E does, in terms of logics of people just sort of being able to have everything done by machines. Because I think it does reveal something important about the nature of simulation in varied contexts. And I want to think first about, the definition of simulation, right? And we can think about several, the etymology. Oh, I don't know what that. I don't know. This is the tech is biting back in Edward Tenner's words. So yeah. So we can think about this area of simulation, and I think that in some level there's a certain duality to simulation, right? That it feels so much like the real thing, it's not the real thing. And one thing we might want to consider as just an initial either practical or ethical clue as to what might be the problem with simulations is simulations are becoming more and more sophisticated. I saw, for example, recently a driving school in China that had extraordinary simulations of what it's like to drive as a training tool. But when you think about higher stakes scenarios, like a plane or a surgeon or something like that, would you trust that to be done by someone that had only worked with simulated patients or only driven simulated in a simulated scenario, or not? And I think that's a good question that we can return to as we think about the promise and limits of simulation in varied contexts. One of the things I think of simulation as part of computational thinking. And this presentation, this project of mine, is part of a larger project where I'm trying to explore the contours of non-algorithmic thought. You may say, well, that's a really abstract and negative research agenda. And it's true, I'm maybe an abstract and negative guy. But I think the reason why I wanted to pursue it was because I was presenting one time at a law school I taught at a few years ago at Brooklyn Law School. And I was presenting critiques of algorithmic thought. And one of my colleagues said, isn't all thought algorithmic? Like, are you essentially an advocate of irrationalism, emotion, and just brute feeling? And I say, well, no, I don't think that. I think there's actually lots of forms of thought that are non-algorithmic. And part of my critique of simulation is to explore the limits of simulation as a mode of computational thinking, which is what Jeanette Wing sort of describes these different aspects of simulation, of computational thinking. And so this project, just to contextualize it, is meant to explore the limits of simulation in various areas. And then finally, I close with how I would regulate it to make sure that those limitations, those problems of simulation, don't have too many practical troubling impacts on individuals. Okay? So moving forward, let's start with something really concrete, problems of simulated prose. Okay? One of the things that ChatGPT, Claude, other generative AI is particularly good at is generating massive amounts of text, right? I mean, you just have this incredible situation where machine-written language may become the norm on the internet and human-written language the exception. That's imaginable within 5, 10, 15 years, right? Because if you just have gatekeepers of the internet who are unwilling to filter, this could happen. And one example of this is 404 Media has done some really interesting exposés of the rise of generative AI content on Amazon and Google. And there were tons of books that were being put up on Amazon. Amazon eventually put a limit of 3 books per day could be put up by any author, right? And so on the one hand, and from a computer standpoint, that's really unfair. I mean, the computer is saying or thinking, you know, I could write 1,000 books a day, right? And there's actually one venture capitalist, Mark Andreessen, had this quote where I think he said on a podcast, you know, why aren't the novelists of today writing 400 books a day? I mean, generative AI gives them that opportunity, right? And so there's this sort of way in which you could say this incredible, almost inhuman level of productivity is attained by the machines. But simultaneously, that would be a net gain if, for example, words were like food, right? If we could just create as much food as possible, nobody would have to go hungry, right? Of course, we'd have to distribute it, as Amartya Sen notes in his work on phantoms and affluence. But you know, we'd have to distribute, but there would be a net good. And there's many things which we could say if we had an unlimited amount of them would probably be a net good, or at least some, you know, not very many limits. But with words, the idea here is that really what we're engaged in the public sphere is not only trying to create more and more words about either reality or just words that are fluent textually, we also are competing for attention. And the ways in which, say, this incredible amount of simulated prose can upset the balance of what have come to be very calibrated, or at least very complex forms of seeking attention, I think we really have to pay attention to. we are on the verge of what I would call, say, a spam world, right, under Kirschenbaum. And some of the examples I give here are, there was a science fiction magazine called Clark's World, and it was very important to them to have an active slush pile, or I shouldn't say a slush pile, to have an active open submissions, right? And these open submissions, most of them were in a slush pile, of course, because there's so much stuff that came in. But they wanted to, at least in principle, be able to read everything and to provide some people who had never had the science fiction story published the opportunity to publish, right? But then they started getting overwhelmed by generative AI subscription or submissions. And this overwhelming nature of them threatens the openness of the system to, say, human work, right? And one of the things that we should discuss at some point is the debate over whether you can identify generative AI-driven content, right? A lot of folks in security who are at the intersection of generative AI and security say, there's no way you can, right? Because any watermark is fragile relative to the power of those who could break it, who would hack it, et cetera. But I also think that we have to try to, at least try, because a lot of the people who might be using this in an amateurish way or in a more layman type way, they won't know the most cutting edge ways of breaking a watermark. And so therefore, sort of marking this stuff out is really important. I should note again also this week, a really humorous anecdote. There was a law professor that wrote a article sort of questioning or just looking at the general idea of whether we need to know if something is generated by AI or not. But it turned out that two of the professor's footnotes appeared to be generated by generative AI. And that caused a huge controversy because one of them attributed to John Danaher, a leading philosopher of this area, ideas that he were completely opposed to what he believes. So it's really interesting that even within work on whether we need to know about generative AI, there is sometimes undisclosed generative AI in part of it, it appears. That at least was what appeared to be happening in that example. So this, I think, is a problem. And I've also looked at this in the context of law. So I gave a talk that's up on YouTube for the Journal of Cross-Disciplinary Research and Computational Law on what would happen if everybody could submit court filings, could submit regulatory filings, et cetera. Imagine a world where regulatory agencies ask for comment and people with generative AI can just generate 5,000 pages of reasons why we shouldn't regulate or reasons why we should regulate, et cetera. Again, this is straining at a human system where we have some obligation under the rule of law for a human judge or regulator to actually read everything, right? And so therefore, we have to be very cautious about this possibility, whether as pure generative AI material or as generative AI sort of accelerating what a human being can submit. Also, there's sort of this question of like a loss of reality, right? So for a brief time, this was the result for Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. And clearly it's not, right? They did not have glow-in-the-dark earrings at that time in Europe. But I think what's fascinating about this is you might say, well, it's just people having fun. Google shouldn't be isn't an authoritative registry of the world, and people should learn early on that it's not. And perhaps that's one way of poo-pooing this and sort of diminishing its importance. But I also think that there are cultural theorists like Olivier Roy and Thorsten Botz-Bornstein who've talked about deculturation and particularly the rise of algorithmic culture as a way of dissolving or weakening common cultural bonds. And you can see how this might happen, right? It may well be that I get a result that says, that has the right girl with a pearl earring, whereas somebody who, say, has searched less art history gets this. And in some ways, we lose a common culture to the extent that there are these simulations or deep fakes or what have you of different forms of art, experience, text out there. And I think that is a problem. I think it's something that we should take seriously, even if there are those who would argue that there's a freedom to create these images. Should there also be a freedom to circulate them and to rank them as the authoritative representation in response to words that really ought to call up other images or the more authentic images, right? I also know that disinformation is a really important aspect of simulation, right? And this is, there are some examples that I'll give that I think are deeply troubling in terms of simulation being used to fake people out or to lead to false conclusions about reality. There's been lots of political deepfakes out there. And some of them are just simulations or avatars of a person sort of saying what that person would say if they were around, and are relatively easy to spot. But others are really meant to deceive. And this question of intention is a very important one, I think. So, one idea is here's the Pope in a puffer jacket, right? And I have to confess, I actually, when I first saw this, I thought, I was looking very quickly and I just thought, well, I guess Pope Benedict had Prada slippers and now Balenciaga for Francis, et cetera. So, but of course, and you might say, well, boy, I'm a particularly gullible consumer of visual culture. I may plead guilty. But I, of course, as I look closer at it, if you look more closely, it seems very clearly fake, right? But I think that there's going to be, as generative AI becomes more powerful, you're going to get the ability to, I don't know, roughen up an image a bit, add elements of reality that would make people think, yeah, this is the real thing. Right? Now, I should note that in response to California's Bot Disclosure Act, a couple of US legal scholars, Kalo and Angel, have a piece that does question whether you can regulate this because it might be art, right? Someone might say, my artistic practice is not merely to create fake images of the Pope, but to put them out into the world in a way that could confuse people about whether they're real or not. Okay? And so I do think that's an interesting question of artistic freedom, right? I come down on the other side because I think if you have such an expansive concept of art, you end up swallowing up perhaps elements of unfair competition law, trademark law, IP law, lots of other stuff. And I don't think that that's really, we want to go in that direction. But I wanted to raise it because I think that this sort of the free play of ideas and meanings is going to make it very difficult for societies committed to free expression to draw the lines that you need to draw in order to limit the dissemination of deepfakes, simulations, et cetera. I also know here's an image of the Pentagon that was burning Pentagon that was probably the first deepfake or one of the ones that had an immediate result, sort of practical result, in that markets dropped briefly, like I think 0.5% or something, and then came back up when people thought this was a real image. What's also remarkable is the spread of deepfakes within a larger media context. So, for example, under Elon Musk, X started selling just the blue tick to almost anybody. And as you can see, this blue tick is sort of meant to be something like verified, but it really just means they pay $8 a month. And they're not really policing trademarks. So this was Bloomberg feed that looks exactly like the typeface of Bloomberg, again, for our trademark fans out there. And it's kind of remarkable that this was just a totally fake thing that was allowed on and that seemed authoritative, that sort of further could muddy the waters or confuse people. I bring it up because there's an interesting discussion within communications scholarship of whether technology is the problem or whether the larger context in which the technology is used is the problem. So this one, score 1 for the context people, right? But I also think that we can't just sort of like wash our hands of the technology and say, well, I guess we're just in a rotten context and it's a Wild West and anything goes. I think we really have to start thinking about how can we sort of improve the socio-technical system that includes pretty reckless actors like X's right now, and how we sort of respond to that. And I'm going to have some examples later on, or some proposals later on that are more concrete. But I just bring this up to show something of the depth of the problem. There also are deepfakes, and this was an example of a deepfake that was circulated. It was reported by the BBC of Donald Trump with Black voters in the US. And a lot of people say, well, deepfakes, anyone could recognize this as a fake, it shouldn't have any effect, et cetera. But when the BBC reported on it, they actually talked to a voter who said, wow, I guess Trump is really making inroads with our community, and this is, that's a positive thing to see. And I think it's really interesting to sort of think about, to what extent do we consider this sort of free play of images as one part of depictions of the dreams, fantasies, hopes of a campaign, and to what extent do they become part of a propaganda operation that is intensely deceptive and meant to create utterly false impressions of the real public sphere. And I think the true impact is very hard to tell because of the trade secrecy of these platforms. It's very hard to figure out how far this was disseminated and who it affected. I would also note that, it's not just deepfakes of images of politicians, et cetera. We now have the problem of counterfeit people. This was a problem even as of 2020. there were face generators, and all of these people don't actually exist. But you could imagine all of them being the avatars for social media profiles that would then be used by content farms, engagement farms, et cetera, to encourage people to vote in a certain way and who could look authentic, et cetera. And of course, if they pass the Turing test, if anyone says, "Are you a real person?" To have 1,000 different ways of arguing, "Yeah, indeed I am." And this sort of counterfeit people problem, I think, is really an issue because these chatbots can be able to generate text, videos, interactions with social media sites. There are also security problems involved. So this is fake persons in terms of faces. We can imagine advances in generative AI video making them fake videos of these people. And in fact, in one version of my talk, I have a video of fake anchors, fake people who are anchoring the Hong Kong Free Press and other online sites. And this can just keep going and going. There are sites now that even, I talked to someone at ANU who said that when they tried to speak to payroll there, that they tried to say, do you want to use your voice as your password? And I was surprised because voice cloning technology is out of the bag, right? I mean, this is relatively straightforward to do with, I think, 30 seconds of someone's voice. Maybe even it's down to 5 seconds now. So things that were, 5 or 10 years ago, security modes that seem relatively secure, my voice is my password on some sort of, when calling the bank or something, because of this technology are now being rendered obsolete. And this, I think, is a real problem of security, both in the narrow sense of someone might be able to more easily break into someone's account, and also in the broader social sense. And Bruce Schneier has sort of described this as sort of a security problem on the social level, in terms of just not knowing whether when you see someone's face next to a social media profile, it's a real person, or just from the website, this person does not exist, or generative AI, et cetera. I'll also note a bit about the virtual friend. So another form of simulation is marketing by companies like Replica, Shall I, others, of a virtual friend. They'll say that it's not just that we're providing words to you, but there's an avatar out there that cares about you. And the advertisement is, chat about everything. The more you talk to Replica, the smarter it becomes, right? Your avatar, just confess more and more, talk more about your life, right? But to me, part of the future of media literacy is to say to people, don't think of this thing as your friend, think of it as a particularly sophisticated probe, right? Trying to find out more and more things about you that you might not reveal via the websites you visit or other forms of tracking. And I think this is going to lead to some interesting conflicts because there are people that will maybe sincerely attach to these things. I believe that the Italian Data Protection Authority briefly stopped either this or another chatbot because of concerns about its effect on vulnerable users. And one of the things they found was that, and I think the company started doing less intimate conversation as a result of some of these things. And then they found people who had a dependency on it, which I thought was really interesting, and troubling in many ways. As there's this sort of idea that it's not merely you're watching something or have interactive media, but the sense that a simulated person is actually a friend, is a simulated friend. And I think that, in some ways, when you get to the point where AI companies, generative AI companies are marketing, this is not just a tool for people or some interactive media, but as their friend, it reminds me of the theory of William Bogard, who, 30 years ago, remarkably prescient work, wrote in Simulation and Surveillance about its connection to a concept of hypercontrol. The idea that if you were to accept these AI bots as friends or as humans with the same rights and prerogatives that you have, that you would ultimately be subject to a certain level of hypercontrol to the extent that the simulation would, in a way, erase subjectivity, right? Would sort of, or you wouldn't sort of have, you'd be so under the control of the people behind the simulation that it really does threaten the subjectivity of the person who wants to believe it so much. And I think that this also helps us understand the sort of, do we live in a simulation philosophy, right? So there's a lot of questioning, or there's been a recent vogue. I think Elon Musk once said, maybe we live in a simulation. It's kind of popular in Silicon Valley to look at these sort of history of philosophy that has culminated in questions like this. And I think they're interesting philosophical questions, but if people persist in them, then I think they have a certain way of being propaganda for simulation, in the sense of saying, well, whatever you've been living was actually the simulation, and just dive into this different one, right? And that's where I think they perform a certain social function that advances certain business interests that needs to be called out and recognized. It's not simply a matter of philosophical inquiry, it becomes a matter of advancing a certain business agenda at a certain point. Might include Ishiguro's novel Clara and the Sun in that category, but I will reserve judgment for now. But I think it's a very interesting sort of question, this idea of simulation, and do we live in a simulation, et cetera. And of course, the movie Samantha, in the movie Her, there's the character Samantha, and I'm sure many of us have seen this film, and it raises this really interesting question of what is the right thing for a friend to do when someone says, well, I've fallen in love with an AI or a bot, or here the operating system Samantha, right? I mean, it seems on the one hand, the compassionate act is to be very cosmopolitan and accepting, which is what these friends do in the movie. But it also seems as though there might be a counter-ethical duty to question whether this is really a proper attribution of emotion or concern in the world. And I think that's a really important question. I also note that, what's kind of funny about these movies like Her is it turned out that Sam Altman seems to be really enamored of that movie. And it's odd because, the movie seemed to have been like a cautionary tale. And it reminds me of this tweet from Alex Buckman where, sci-fi authors say things like, in my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. 10 years later, a tech company says, we'd love to tell you we've now got the torment nexus. So, and that I think is sort of what the OpenAI with its recent chatbots, to the point where they actually simulated Scarlett Johansson's voice, right? They were in negotiations with her. There's very interesting legal issues about the extent to which her voice is protected. It's not protected under copyright law. You can't copyright your voice. But under right of publicity law in some jurisdictions, there would be something in the nature of a trademark violation to use someone's voice in a commercial context without their permission. And so this is a really interesting sort of idea that, you sort of see this. Of course, the metaverse, I think, is another example there as well. I don't think anyone that has read Snow Crash carefully thinks of it as a manual for great tech innovation. I think it's really reads much more as a very cautionary tale. And just a little bit more on this, again, this sort of uncanny valley that we're approaching, right? And sort of, or maybe this crosses the uncanny valley for some people. And that's another interesting sort of idea, is that as generative AI proliferates, the idea of a unitary uncanny valley, I think, might be fragmented. So for some people, this avatar might cross it, and actually they might respond to it better than they would to a human. I think of that as one of the more chilling aspects of what is otherwise a rather campy movie, Megan. I don't know if anyone's seen Megan, but this part of it is that the doll is so ingratiating to the child that the child by the end is far more attached to the doll than to her own mother, right? And so this is part of what I think is so both fascinating and disturbing about the potential for simulated sociality online, is that crossing of the uncanny valley, or diverse uncanny valleys that may be out there that are going to be potentially luring people in, drawing people in. And it's gone to the point of even, from the companion who cares to the chatbot lover. The New York Times had a really interesting video from women who had virtual boyfriends who were very attached to them. And you wonder, to what extent is it play acting, or is there sort of a sincere belief that this is like a relationship on the par with an in-person relationship? It's a very interesting sort of idea that I would love to see more research on. But I think it sharpens the question of simulation and its proper limits. I want to think about, what is the larger result here? Because part of what my critique of simulation here is really a critique of subjectivism, okay? For people that want to argue for the value of the simulated friendships, simulated companions, lovers, what have you, they might say, well, my interaction with this machine has been far more satisfying and productive to me than my interaction with people, and you should respect that. But what novelists tend to do, I think in very interesting ways, like Rachel Cusk, like in her novel Transit, is they tend to think about what are the larger social implications if that presentation of self and of the goals of the self is accepted in the societal context. And one of the things that Kusk talks about toward the beginning of her book is a man who becomes very enamored of and comfortable by automated voices on trains and buses. And she just drops as like a side note. It's not bolded, I bolded, but this female voice that guided him while he was driving his car, it was so much more devoted than his wife ever had been, right? And this idea, I think, that's fascinating is the sort of unfair competition of some of these bots in the sense that they themselves don't have bodily needs, goals, aspirations. And so in a way, they are, it's the same sort of dynamic where people say, well, the robots will outcompete human beings because they don't need lunch breaks, they don't need dinner, they don't need vacation, et cetera. To the same extent, the virtual companion, the virtual friend, doesn't have any of their own interests, and in that way can sort of outcompete a real friend. And that, I think, is troubling, and it is part of a general power of simulation, if accepted to be as normatively desirable as the real thing. So that's one of the things why I want to sort of question it further. I'd also note that, like, I would propose there's something like Gresham's law of currency here in terms of like simulated versus actual human interaction, where it becomes just as if you have money in society and the fake money is much cheaper to make, it becomes more uncertain about what's fake and what's real. Eventually, the fake money drives out the real money. What's less dear to produce drives out what's more dear to produce. And I think there's something very possible here. Of course, we should also talk about possibilities of catalyzing human interaction via virtual interaction. That's possible too. But I think this Gresham's law is more likely to be the dynamic involved. I also want to think about this from a broader lens of what Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres have called test-crealism. Okay, and I know this is an awkward acronym, but I think it's a very useful one. And they just published their article in First Monday a few months ago on this concept. They've been talking about it for a long time. The idea is that there's a suite of ideologies, transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, et cetera, that value computational processing as much as human thought. Okay, that's one aspect of them. And to give a very concrete example of where that goes, this is from Mark's book, Automated Media. It begins with this very interesting anecdote about Ray Kurzweil, whose father passed away. And he creates this sort of simulation of his father, where essentially he can ask questions and it answers in the way that his father would. And this is now being done with generative AI by companies. I mean, there are companies now that create what are called death bots or deepfakes of the dead. So the founder of one of these companies said, I really missed my mother. I fed in all of her emails and other things into this thing, and now I can talk to her beyond the grave. And it's fascinating to sort of think about this as a way of a mode of technological immortality, or technology taking on what has long been a religious promise. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we can see these sort of simulations of persons when there's an assistance upon the simulation being treated the way that a person would be. I'd also note that there are problems where if we were to really take that seriously, right? If we were to take seriously the idea that the bot is the same as the parent or the loved one, et cetera, who's no longer here, we probably would have to think of its well-being, right? And some aspects of test-creal theory actually say that human beings are under an obligation to create as many simulations of human thought as possible, because all that really matters is dedicated or self-reports of well-being. So if you had billions of simulations or trillions of them saying, oh, I'm having infinite joy as this simulation, right? That would be something we would need to try to create. And I'm not saying that this is like behind all the other simulations that I just mentioned, but I'm just saying this is a way of pushing forward what philosophical consequences might arise out of a commitment to the idea that a simulated person is as valuable as a real person, right? So that's one of the ideas here as well. So how should we treat these advanced simulations? And I have an image from Remedios Vero here, which I think is in some ways resonant with the way I would propose we treat them. I think that, to the extent people are arguing for robot rights or other types of robot or simulation value, maybe we treat some of them like the way we treat fine art, right? And under the Visual Artists' Rights Act, there are some particularly works of recognized stature that we would not allow to be destroyed, that we require attribution to, et cetera. So maybe that for the most valuable or socially valued robots or simulations or AIs in our midst, we might do that. But I don't think we want to cross the line into treating them like people. Now I want to shift direction a little bit and talk a little bit about therapeutic horizons here, right? Because I've talked a lot about the simulated friendship, simulated other aspects of simulation. What about simulated therapy, right? Well, Ilya Sutskever of OpenAI has said that in the future, we will have wildly effective and dirt cheap AI therapy, right? Instead of going to a therapist, people will just talk to a bot, okay? And this is one vision that could be thought of as like fully automated luxury communism, right? Just automate everything, automate the care work, automate everything else. But I think it's kind of troubling because these models don't feel in the way that they're simulating or pretending that they feel. And one really practical example of this is when a researcher fed Wobot, which is one of these automated AI therapists, the line, "I think I could just jump off of this cliff or this canyon," it came back saying, "It's so wonderful you're taking care of your mental and physical health," right? And this is really a problem with these things because they're just word predictors, right? And I began my talk with some, complicated math as art, because they're just tokenizing relationships between words as variables. And you can kind of understand how this result might come about, right? Usually when people talk about walking around, the bot is going to have some, correlation of that with exercise, which is good for depression, so therefore encourage it, right? But it doesn't really understand what's happening. And I think this is, and that's one reason why I highly recommend Alison Pugh's book, The Last Human Job, because in her work, it's a theme of this work is how in these care contexts, an ability to empathize and to understand is so critical to the work itself. It's not just about doing certain things or saying certain words. It's about the shared subjective or intersubjective experience of pain, of difficult situations, et cetera. So I think that's why I highly recommend that in this context. And I think that, these crisis failures of simulations are unsurprising because they're language models, not knowledge models, right? They're simulating the act of thought without actually going through what human thought is as an embodied entity. So that I think is, an explanation for what's going on. And this in turn is what leads me to, where I would take us on a policy level, this sort of foundational realization of what's going on with simulation. It should lead us in certain policy directions. So my legal responses are based on my recent book, The New Laws of Robotics. I propose 4 laws in it, and I'll go through the application of each of them. I just wanted to make a note that I particularly love this cover of the book. It's from the Spanish translation, and it's a reference to the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Nightingale, which is about an emperor who had a nightingale. There was a nightingale in his garden. He loved the song of the nightingale, but sometimes the nightingale wouldn't sing. So he said ultimately, I just want to have a machine that makes this song, and this was, and they created a machine for him. And ultimately, he neglected the nightingale, didn't care if the tree that it was living in survived or died, et cetera, and it left. The machine ultimately broke, and then he had nothing, right? And I think that's something of a metaphor for what these simulations might end up doing in our world, is that we might allow them to replace real human connection, real human expertise, real human experience, but then find that we're either disillusioned by them, that they're abused, that they're used in ways that we didn't expect, and that we could end up as hapless or as stranded in a way as the emperor if we become as reliant on them as he was. So one of the things that I bring up in the book is this idea of a new law of AI and robotics, that AI should complement professionals, not replace them. This is premised on sort of a larger theory of labor, that there's a certain professional prerogative, and that those in professions, many unions, many forms of organized labor, have a deal with society, which is that they engage in ongoing reflection, self-reflection, and reflection on the nature of their work to improve how they do their work and to measure its effectiveness, in return for certain privileges of being able to organize their work or to contribute to the organization of their work and to have input into management of their work. And I think that that's going to be very important to guarantee things like that in educational, therapeutic, other contexts. I was really heartened to see that recently in Massachusetts, there's a proposed law that says that if a mental health practitioner recommends, or I'm sorry, if an insurer encourages the use of AI chatbot therapy, that people actually be able to be given a choice of the AI chatbot or a human therapist in mental health contexts. That sort of is something that would be guaranteed by the health system. Because certainly all economic pressure will be to get rid of the human that costs $60 an hour or whatever the rate is, and to replace them with an AI chatbot that costs $2 a month, right? That will be the pressure. And I think without legal restrictions on that type of pressure, you could see the destruction of the vocation of therapy within a decade or so. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. There are other professions where we could talk about that type of application. I also note that this is my second law of robotics and AI, and it's really about authenticity and about sort of not counterfeiting humanity. I mentioned earlier Gresham's law and sort of the analogy between fake money and fake interactions. I think that I follow Carissa Veliz, who's a terrific theorist of privacy and data protection, in saying that really there shouldn't be use of emojis by AI, right? I mean, it might seem from the perspective of affective computing that it's really a good thing for a machine to sort of smile at you, or to send emojis, or to try to make you feel better, or to soften the edges of interaction. But I think in a way that's very deceptive, because for one thing, the AI doesn't have a face. It doesn't have the sort of combination of rational and biological capacities that are essential to emotion. I do realize that the question of emotion is a complicated one, and I'm actually working on this in a current project called Artificial Emotion, the Computational Subversion of Resonance, that I'll get into in a little bit. But I really do think that this is an important thing to look at, is to think about to what extent is this deceptive, and should unfair and deceptive acts and practices law restrict it? And no faking an emotion and trying to de-anthropomorphize responses. What might that look like? Well, here's an example from an article called Mirages on anthropomorphism and dialogue systems. And there's debates going on right now among all of the makers of chatbots about how should they present themselves when asked questions like, do you love the feeling of sun on your skin, right? One way of doing it is to say, well, quote, as an AI language model, I don't have a physical form, et cetera. But for the authors of this paper, that is even a little suspect, because it has the rhetoric of subjectivity in it, And I find I was recently in a collection called Being Human, and we talk about various robots in the collection, and I always use the term it for it because it's an object, whereas some people use, say, he, she, this, et cetera. But I think that really this is sort of, this comparison is useful because it's kind of deprogramming or breaking the spell of the subjective self-presentation of the robot or simulation of a person or of a consciousness, et cetera, where the better response would probably be, this generative language model does not have a physical form, this model does not have personal experiences or emotion, et cetera. I guess we can talk later on about whether the third person conveys some sort of other personage, but at least it's not sort of like adopting, cloaking itself in the rhetoric of subjectivity. Another new law would be that generative AI should not intensify zero-sum arms races. So this is something I'm really committed to in various contexts with AI and robotics. And here I think we could talk about, for example, disclosure of the use of generative AI to generate legal complaints. And we may find that legal systems have two piles of complaints, and they'll first look at the ones that did not have this assistance, and then if they have time, look at the other ones, right? Because there's just the possibility of so many being generated by those systems. There's even a system called click notices in the US where landlords can automatically generate evictions, right? And that was before generative AI. It can become even faster, more accelerated. Also, limitations on entries into writing, art, and other competitions, or maybe you have human and AI enhanced tracks. I mean, these are very minimal recommendations, but they at least help us to create these two different realms of experience, so it doesn't just get all jumbled up and we're all forced into using it. Because if that happens, if we don't have this sort of separation, I think then we all end up being forced into using it in various contexts just to compete. The fourth new law would be attribution, right? That generative AI must always indicate itself as such with ready identification of the identity of its creators, controllers, and owners, and the data sets it was based on, right? And that is an area where, again, I follow Timnit Gebru, Deb Raji, Abeba Burhane on sort of disclosing these data sets. So that's really critical because it can be based on highly biased data. We need to be able to take its results with a grain of salt based on the data that it was built on. So all of these things I think are really critical. And I think also I recommend the Electronic Privacy Information Center report, Generating Harm, which gives even further legal recommendations. My recommendations are all based on the laws from my book, and they come out of the epilogue to the Spanish translation. But I mean, there are certainly many more laws that we could impose here. But in conclusion, the last thing I want to note is that, there's an emerging talk of a right to reality, where people are saying there's just so much fake generative AI stuff out there that we really need to have some right to reality out there. And I really prefer the critical formulation of limiting distortions and fakery, because you're always going to get the pushback, what's reality? There's a million different realities. Everybody has a different reality, et cetera. So I just want to sort of make that negative note, to say this is a critical project. But in the long run, I think we need to develop a deeper account of the value of the real and the resonant. And I think that's what these books do. I know that I'm just, it's kind of like very quickly recommending 2 large books, but I think that they help us philosophically. And I think that may be part of the future of critical AI theory, is further articulating the real and the resonant and the types of values that we're at risk of losing if we allow the unfettered advance of unattributed and untrammeled simulation. So with that, thanks so much. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious about your last law of attribution.
Yes.
It seems to me that if you find some content online and it doesn't have AI attribution, it would follow that you take it as non-AI generated. But then the problem is it just a deep fake, or if it isn't, it's just a deep fake that doesn't have an attribution on it. And as soon as it doesn't have an attribution, you think it's real. So I guess my question is, does attribution mean all data, all content needs to have an attribution, including real, to prove that it's real, or to prove that it's some sort of like hybrid or combination? And in that, then who has that power to attribute?
This is a terrific question, and I think you're thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead of me, which is very good. Because I think you're right to say that if there becomes norms of attribution where some people start attributing, but lots of others don't, and then people start thinking, well, if it doesn't have the attribution to generative AI, then it must be real, then that could be self-defeating. Absolutely. I think that my response to that would be that a lot of these internet platforms, which are the main sources of news, information, entertainment for many people, do have extensive content moderation systems. And my hope would be that part of that content moderation would involve sort of checking up on these sorts of things, whereby you might have a GAI in a corner of generative AI produced images. You might have something along those lines. That may seem very, and to the extent that it is discovered that they're not, then they get taken down. Now, of course, then someone might say, they thought it was generative AI created, but it actually wasn't, and I'm going to prove that, et cetera. That is the type of dispute that goes on with respect to so much forbidden content in content moderation, right? And I think that, the content moderation conversation is a very difficult one. I agree, because there's lots of people who think that content moderation is just pure censorship. I mean, if you look at, like, for example, some of the more right-wing or Republican theorists in the US who try to regulate social media are extremely suspicious of content moderation. On the other hand, I mean, if we didn't have it, if it were just a free-for-all, it would all collapse, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure, like, you would just see the most horrific things in your feed continually. And so I think that, this is part of what I hope to be social responsibility of internet platforms, would be that they would be involved, and perhaps there can be state requirements for this type of attribution as well in places where that is constitutional, permitted. I have to say that, like, a lot of my ideas probably cannot fly in the United States, because I think in the United States there probably would be certain rights, say, against compelled speech that they might put up against this and say, well, this is a compelled speech that you're forcing me to attribute this to generative AI. That'd be one form of legal challenge. There's many other forms of legal challenges that might come up to it. But my hope would be that this would become a norm, and that there could be, and that there would be in jurisdictions that were really committed to it, legal penalties for failing to attribute, and either for the generator of the content or for the disseminator that might be secondarily liable for not catching it or not attributing, et cetera. But yeah.
I'm working in an Australian government in a regulatory area. We're looking at AI. One of the issues that I've got, or one of the interests that I've got, is different countries have different models. So the UK, the EU, and the US have put forward models. Canada is looking at one, and as is China. So the US is a very light touch. China is a very sort of enforced AI model. If we were looking at something that was going to be effective internationally and also domestically, how can you regulate for the goods and the bads of AI, not only now, but into the future? And how would you monitor that internationally?
Yes. Well, one thing, that's a terrific question. And I want to start with sort of an idea of, I've been very critical in this talk. I want to say, like, this talk was largely about the use of AI in the public sphere, entertainment, therapy, and replacements of people. I think there's lots of AI that is very exciting in the realm of simulating chemical processes, physical processes, medical processes, et cetera. And one of the ways in which I would market my own, let's say, heavy touch heavy regulatory burden that I'm imposing and would propose in many of these areas that I talked about today, is that might lead to a reallocation of talent to some of these areas in medicine and physical sciences and other areas where the talent might be used more productively. So that's one way in which I would market what I'm saying, is to the extent people say, well, you're going to make essentially the provision of these AI chatbots impossible, or you're going to make it very, very difficult to do, maybe that just reallocates talent to another more useful area. When you talk about like the international perspective, it's a really difficult question, I think, because and I think that it may be something that's really difficult to get an international answer on. In the internet law class that I teach, I mean, I do a lot on jurisdiction and how disputes that happen on the internet, how different countries struggle over the proper jurisdiction for where the dispute should be settled. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. But I have to admit that I'm pretty pessimistic about the possibility of there being an international consensus on almost anything that I brought up today. I mean, I would think attribution might be one, where maybe there could, that just seems like a relatively straightforward one. But I think there will be some nations and cultures that go in exactly the opposite direction of where I'm going. There may be cultures that and in the Oxford Handbook of AI Ethics, one of the essays sort of contrasts Korean, Chinese, and Japanese approaches to AI. And one of them, I think, would be much more open to some of the simulations that I mentioned than others. And so that was work by Danik Gall. So I do think, though, there are areas that need international coordination, but the stuff I'm talking about today, probably we couldn't get it. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Well, coming back to the attribution discussion, on the flip side of this, is there a rights-based discussion that says, on the one hand, there's this regulatory notion of how we apply and regulatory frameworks, and as problematic as that is, it's a necessity. Is the other side of it sort of saying, well, as an individual, my right to know.
Right.
And then the question becomes, that's an agency issue then, and says, well, how do I have agency in the context of that? And what is my ability to express that and get some response?
Great. Yeah, I really like that question, James, and I think that this is this idea of the right to reality is one framing of this, sort of the right to, or the right to know. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of debates over disclosure of ingredients in foods, right? So, I mean, when that began, a lot of companies said, I don't want to disclose it, or it's a trade secret. I mean, that was in the US, actually, Philip Morris won a case saying that Massachusetts said they had to disclose how much of each ingredient was in their cigarettes. And they said that's a trade secret and it's constitutionally protected. And if you want to force us to disclose it, you have to pay the entire value of Marlboro, which would be $85 billion or something. So that was that would have been the entirety of the Massachusetts state budget. So we still don't know what ingredients are in the cigarettes, or at least that law was not couldn't get through. So I think of this as, in that way, a consumer protection, consumer rights issue. And perhaps that's how we need to reframe it, is to frame it as a consumer rights issue where people sometimes have a preference for certain processes by which things are made. And just as I might have a preference for a process that does not involve child labor, I also may have a preference for a process that doesn't involve generative AI. And if you don't give it to me, if you are just going to, so that I think is a way of making this more in line with past versions of regulation. It's not something totally new. It's just like, well, we know what's in our food. We should know what's in our images or the stories or things like that. So yeah, thanks.
I'm very sympathetic to your sort of defense of reality against simulation, but I wonder if you've not set yourself on path to a more sort of dramatic confrontation with liberalism.
Yes.
Think of the history, particularly in relation to religion. There's lots of people out there who love their imaginary friends, who are comforted by the idea that there's something out there that cares deeply about them. And traditionally, the state has just pulled back from wanting to insist on a kind of collective reality in relation to at least religious beliefs. But it seems to me a lot of what you're suggesting is, I say I love my replica loves me. You come along and point out rightly that it doesn't. But it does seem to me that you're setting the stage for the state to take on a role that historically it's been very reluctant to take in relation to at least religious disputes, and I suspect a whole range of other matters. So I guess you mentioned you didn't think this flew in the US, but I'm curious about whether you think it's possible to reconcile with the history of liberal political thought more generally.
Thank you. Yes, this is a really terrific question. And I think I'm going to answer it in a slightly roundabout way, but I think but I think I need to. And the roundabout way that I'd say is that I was at one point working with David Columbia. He's a good, really great theorist of the digital who is recently passed away, but his book, Cyber-Libertarianism, is coming out soon, and I think it'll be a really influential book. He and I talked about a concept a First Amendment fascism. And the idea of it was that while many American legal commentators thought of the First Amendment and free expression protection as the very core of the liberal project in the United States, to the extent that First Amendment law started expanding and even metastasizing to include the idea that billionaires spending billions of dollars in an election, that was their free speech, and that people could lie and with impunity, like the US versus Alvarez case, that was also part of free speech, and that these Animal Crush videos were also free speech. Those could sort of be distributed online generally. That it became part of what is it being conducive to what theorists of authoritarianism and totalitarianism have called the problem of everything is possible and nothing is true. That is the title of Peter Pomerantz's book about Russia. And I think that there's an interesting sort of idea here in which if there's this kind of runaway public sphere where one group of people can just believe in entirely alternative facts and about the world, I think maybe that is I think kind of troubling and undermines the democratic foundations of liberalism. Of course, there's tension between liberalism and democracy, and that's a great field of political theory. So I'm not answering your question directly yet. One question that I might raise is perhaps the difference here is that the religious thought is about a supernatural world, whereas this is about a real world or about the world around us, So maybe that's one distinction. Another distinction I might make is that this is not everything is religion, but this is sort of potentially these are beliefs about they're not framed by many people as religious. Although I have to admit, in part of my talk, I talked about singularitarianism as a form of like making religious promises of immortality. So I guess no, you got me. No, just kidding. No, I think it's very. I think that the answer I would give is the foundations of a liberal society are reasonable pluralism, right? And that you can't have sort of, and this even goes back to John Rawls's discussion of the toleration of the intolerant. So I think in political liberalism, Rawls himself has a discussion about the great difficulty for a liberal regime in how it treats intolerant people who say they want to, say, get rid of liberalism, right? I mean, you have this problem in Germany with respect to, say, the rise of far-right parties, and there's been litigation going back to the 90s about, are they allowed to run for office, right? If you run for office saying, I want to end democracy, I want to end liberalism, I want to put everyone who's not my political ally in jail, right? Some would say, well, that's just the way liberalism rolls, and if it turns out that party wins, oh well. But then there's a more militant democracy school that says that if you have parties in society that are avowed and committed to abolishing liberalism and democracy, that the only self-defense of liberalism is to ban them, right? And I think that goes to like Popper's paradox of tolerance, Karl Popper's work in this area. So I might say that like akin to militant democracy being a mode of self-defense of liberalism and democracy, that militant realism or militant reality is a necessary condition for a robust public sphere, that we don't have people sort of spinning off into their own alternative versions of what is human, something as fundamental as that. But it is true that like ideas like what I proposed, they're far easier to impose in, say, a regime, a non-liberal regime. I won't dispute that.
I work in the AI policy design space. I'm really curious about how to operationalize these 4 laws into regulatory design. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts for what's the easiest or what's the best point of entry for regulators? Is it after the chatbot is on the market? Is it at the model stage where it's tokenizing relationships between variables? Is it regulating in like high-risk contexts like healthcare or therapy? Or is it like educating the consumer about watermarking and attribution? I'm just curious to know whether you've thought through or whether you have any recommendations for like Australian regulators who are trying to build guardrails around the use of generative AI.
Sure, and one thing that I think I really appreciate that, and I think that in thinking about like this first one, I think that going back to the AI Now report of 2017, which I thought was a really, AI Now Institute has done these terrific reports on AI, and they were way ahead of the curve on these sort of issues. And one of the things they emphasized was the necessity of professional regulation sort of feeding into this. And so I think that you mentioned high-risk contexts. Yeah, I think that to the extent that there's a medical AI, we want to get the insight and input of doctors who are going to say this is the proper way to introduce it, et cetera. It's funny that I just came back from a conference where one of the speakers was saying a lot of doctors are resisting AI, so we've got to think about ways to get them to stop resisting, right? Like nudge them toward it. And I was saying, I think it's kind of the opposite. I think there's a lot of people who are putting a little too much faith in it, and they need to sort of have a more critical perspective, at least in these mental health contexts that I went over. So I think that's one aspect of it. With respect to this, I think that the human-computer interaction literature is practical in the way that you're asking for, in terms of saying like, maybe getting rid of the I talk here, right? And that would be something that might be on the very higher levels of the models where you could sort of say, this is, we are making this a more generalizable rule. In a lot of my work, I've said that the higher, more abstract you get, or the more it's sort of a general purpose model, that maybe transparency is all that we get out of that, but maybe there's more, and maybe this could be part of the more. I think in terms of the zero-sum arms races, this is probably going to be more in a ad hoc context, where we worry that an entity, someone is adopting AI, and then other people are adopting AI to counter the people that are adopting AI. And to just give a really practical example from the US context, in healthcare, we had this problem where insurers were rejecting doctors' claims. Doctors started using computer software to automate the response to the insurer's denial. Then insurers started getting more sophisticated software to automate the repeated denial of the doctor's appeal of the initial denial. And it just kept going, right? And so I think that you've got to sort of when those sorts of dynamics start happening, there's a real need for regulators to come in and say, wait a second, there's a huge investment here that's not really paying off. And then finally, the attribution one, I think that's one where rules of distribution or rules of like saying, if you're creating these AI images, you have some sort of watermark in it would be very helpful. Knowing the watermark could be broken, but also knowing that most of the people disseminating it may not know how to break it. And knowing that even if there is software that will break the watermark, you can criminalize trafficking in that software, right? Under laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, there's a criminalization of trafficking in anti-circumvention software that tries to break DRM. Now, I'm not going to comment on the wisdom of that stuff, right? I mean, there's lots of copyright scholars that I think consider that law anathema. But I do think it could be quite useful here in terms of really helping us regain this grip on reality. Thanks.
You can take one last question.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, I've got a comment and a question.
Yeah.
So drawing on my experience as a regulator in this area, one of the observations that I make is that in trying to develop any laws that or any regulatory initiatives that affects the tech industry, you come across, you come against this default regulatory posture that was really set by the Clinton administration, Al Gore in his information superhighway speech, where the default regulatory posture for the tech industry was no regulation or light touch regulation. Like, let's innovate and let's the tech industry, do what it wants, and we'll have very minimal regulation. So we've ended up in this sort of situation where the tech industry has this inordinate power of our life and inordinate control of an influence over what we do, but has hardly any legal responsibilities. I think that's sort of playing out like that. You're not liable for negligence. You're not liable for publishing harmful material. Like we've all seen how difficult that is. And that's also combined with the cyber libertarianism that was common around the time, which denied a government any power to regulate. Like we remember what John Perry Barlow told us at the World Economic Forum, I think in 1996, like you are not the governments, you were not legitimate inside the cyberspace, is what he said. Those two sort of neoliberal cyber libertarian issues seem to reverberate and pollute this debate. So that's one proposition. The second is just in trying to work out my own theories about what regulatory things would work. One of the things that I've been playing with is the idea of forcing or reversing onus of proof, of requiring anyone who deploys AI into a high risk, that's a definitional issue, put it aside. It's a difficult one, but put it aside. Deploys into that high risk area has to actually make a positive case that it won't cause danger. I just wanted to run that past you. I wanted to run the comment and that question.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the background there as well, because the background of things like Section 230 and are very powerful in terms of deregulating. In terms of I think that you're absolutely right about that reverse burden of proof. One way of implementing that is a licensing regime. So like the Gian Claudio Malgieri and I have this article on AI licensing. And our idea is that in a high-risk context, before the system is released, it would have to be licensed. And you'd have to sort of show certain non-harm or demonstrate that. There is currently a law in California that goes in that direction. It's remarkable to me how many tech people are really alarmed by it. And even commentators that I think are very objective, like Arvind Narayanan, has raised deep questions about it, because he thinks it goes too far in terms of forcing model developers to make assurances that they won't cause certain forms of very harmful activity. But I think I'm still behind it. I think it actually is a very wise idea. So I think if you were to, what Malgieri and I just argue is that the EU AI Act, if properly construed, could include something like licensing. And and I think that your formulation of reversing the burden of proof is another way of going in that direction of so I agree with that. Thanks. Yes.
I was just going to ask, I mean, and thank you very much for a fantastic talk.
Thanks.
A lot of what you described, it's kind of binary. There's either generative or there's not generative, but actually the reality is a real mixture. So, you know, I wrote an email to someone the other day and I got ChatGPT to suggest some sentences. I can't even remember which ones I used. I used some of them and then I wrote some other bits myself, or I take photographs, and Lightroom has these astonishing generative film options now, where you just say that little spot there where there was a bit of crap on the lens, just get rid of that and it's gone. And so is that a generative image? So I wondered what you thought about that, because that huge amount of content is actually a mixture of human and generative.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think it would definitely be something where a disclosure, there could be disclosures that are partial, that are just sort of, and I think there also in many areas of law, there's something called a de minimis exception. So for example, there's this very interesting copyright case where in an HBO series, there's a 3-second glimpse of a graffiti artist's painting tag on a garbage bin. And the graffiti artist sued and said, you violated my copyright. You captured that little bit of my image. And the court said, you know, it was up there for 3 seconds. People barely noticed it. It's de minimis. So I think perhaps what you're describing could be an exception in the legal regime where we say, oh, that's de minimis. If you get rid of a dot on a picture, if you have 2 sentences in a 3-paragraph email or something like that. And I do think this would be very interesting for people in coding to think about how to code that, right? How to code what the de minimis would be. Maybe it's a number of words. Maybe it's something along those lines. Maybe it's about the importance of the communication. It's complicated. Yeah, it definitely could be complicated. But I think that there are ways of carving out exceptions or having a percentage generated. I actually, during one of my exams, I actually told my students that you could use generative AI, but it couldn't be more than 40% of the words or something like that, right? And also that you had to underline it. So it was then if you took generative AI material, you had to underline that, and you had to at least, and so they went with it, so and some did do a lot of, and so I think there are ways of at least in important contexts trying to get forms of hybrid disclosure or partial disclosure. Thanks.